there was a time where I wasn't so straightforward, maybe, because I was feeling that people were not ready for a straightforward conversation. And at one point, there was a lot of political correctness that was involved. And later on, I felt that that type of political correctness, or at least the type of, I would say, perhaps the speech in where there's a lot of diplomacy in it, that type of diplomacy carries within it a lot of manipulation. Say it as it is. And at the end of the day, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to judge. That's the most important thing about the lesson in the Quran, is that it was telling it to you with no manipulation. It was putting it for you with complete transparency. And that's the most important thing you learn about even the seerah. The people of Quraysh were giving the Prophet ﷺ a lot of offers to water down the religion, to make it more, quote unquote, inclusive, to make it something that was at least not rejecting their rhetoric and including their way of saying things. In other words, inclusive, literally. And at the same time, it was, somehow carrying some type of a bond. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it really clear that there is no way that in order to make some type of a bond that you're going to be giving up on haqq. There's only one haqq, and it must be said as is. Because the second that you're going to bend haqq to make it appealing to others, then what you're going to be doing, you're going to continue making the bend even more acute. You're going to make the bend even smaller and smaller. And then once you bend, you get closer to their way of life and not got them closer to your way of life. In the beginning, you're going to think that, oh, well, if I'm inclusive, and if I'm going to be somehow making some bond, they're more than you. They will be the ones to later define the narrative, define the terms, and define the standards. Once they are the ones that define all the standards, definitions, and even the way things are interpreted, then at the end, they're the ones with the authority. They're the ones that are going to take the authority, the rule, and you're going to be wiped out without you recognizing. Certain things, I found that people, when you use political correctness, the political correctness gets into that confusion later on from one generation to another. The older generation may recognize in the beginning that, oh, it's a way of diplomacy. But then when I started working at the university, I realized that the younger generation knew nothing about that diplomacy that was used. And all that remained is the new narrative. And the new narrative was adopted as the standard. The new narrative, the new diplomacy was adopted as the new narrative. In fact, it was adopted as if it was Islam. Why? Because many were afraid to say what Islam really says. They used a lot of political correctness, and then the manipulation was later becoming the main standard for interpreting Islam. In the beginning, they thought it was just a diplomatic way of trying to make things, at least that's how they will think of it, that it's in order to reach out to the masses in the West, that it is more, or that it's closer to their way of thinking, when it's not actually closer to the way of thinking. You had adopted a completely different narrative. You had manipulated the whole religion by making a whole different narrative and not recognizing that the narrative that you had laid out. Now, here's one very important thing. Many will think that it's a way of saying things that is very appealing to a Western mind. What many don't recognize is how the Western mind that is now, how it actually got this far. They don't recognize that it's not an issue of this is how they think, but it's an issue that there were a number of different philosophies that had twisted the modern / contemporary / postmodern mind to starting to think that way. Because haqq is haqq. At the end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you that Islam and Quran, la sharqiyya wa la gharbiyya. It's not Eastern, it's not Western, it's clear, it's straightforward, there's no twisting in it. But then many will think that, oh, that way we'll use it this way so it sounds appealing. It's a way, they would think that, oh, it's basically trying to be appealing to the youth that grew up in the West. No, you just adopted a whole philosophy without you recognizing. It's not a word without a root. It's a philosophy that has a root, whether it's in postmodernism, existentialism, nihilism, individualism, and the list goes on and on. If you don't recognize the drive, the root to such a rhetoric, and you're just thinking that, oh, it's just an appealing way, you had actually used kufr and kufr tools to display Islam. There's no way. This is a total discrepancy. There's no way. You're contradicting yourself. You cannot use a kufr method and say that you're trying to display Islam. You're contradicting yourself. There's no way. You can't tell me, yeah, we're going to use some form of a music or some form of a, movie that contains haram to deliver the message of Islam. There's no way. It's the same exact idea. If you're going to say that, oh, hijab is a choice. Hijab is not a choice. There's a difference between when we're talking about the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and between talking about the choice that one makes as when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, let's go to the ayah, وَلَا يَرْضَى لِعِبَادِهِ الْكُفْرِ, that the Lord Almighty does not accept and is never content for his servants to be kafir. In other words, there is a tashri'ah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's a legislature that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had set as a standard. And that simply means, just like when we say, لا يرضى لعباده الكفر, same thing. لا يرضى لعباده المعصية either. The Lord Almighty will not accept sin. To say that, oh, it's the choice that one makes and thinking that, oh, it sounds appealing. No, it's not a choice. It's a ruling of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's a standard. That's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala laid out as a standard that people must adopt. Do they have the free will to choose this or that? Well, under a rule where we cannot enforce Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's laws, we will say under their law, but under Muslim law, no. Under Muslim law, there will be a law that will assign it as mandatory to dress modestly. There will be a mandatory law. Just like there's a law where you cannot dress in a certain way out here in the West. They won't tell you that, yeah, you can dress however you want. There are certain things that you have to cover. You will get a violation for it. There are certain laws in every single country. Anyhow, so let's go and continue now with Surah Nisa. Here we go. Of course, we talked about in Surah Nisa, let's just start out really quick. So we started out with Surah Nisa and where it's laying out اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم. So that was really the prelude. And of course, from that point, in order to have taqwa in relationship to people, then it went to the most vulnerable, the orphans, then talked about the women, then talked about the rights for women in relationship to their mahar.
الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
So then, of course, the ayat would speak about the different rights in relationship to money. So the first one was really speaking about, yes, the rights of the rights for the money in regards to the inheritance for the orphans. And then it spoke about the women's rights in regards to money in relationship to the mahar. And of course, then it lays out the general rule in where when we're speaking about money, we're actually talking about a certain set of guidelines and standards in where money, number one, was supposed to be used, and where the word qiyaman is, in where it's in order to protect one, the deen, two, the life, three, the mental health, and four, the chastity in the family, and five, when we're talking about how the money is coming in and how the money is distributed within the society. And of course, we talked about warzuquhum fiha, and how at times when someone is not using the money in the way that Islam sets out the principle, then we would have a wasi, or we would have a wali. Al-wali comes first to basically help the person that needs that type of guidance to take over, to manage the money for them on a condition that they would be just with that type of management, and that certainly not abuse it on behalf of whoever they're responsible for. And of course, we talked about the emphasis that even if the person, of course, there's one very important thing. There's a qada, and there's also there's a deen part of it. So what does that mean? There are certain rules, there are certain guidelines in where if you are to involve a qadi, pay attention to this one, ladies. Let's say you agree, a woman and her husband, they agreed to go to somebody that is specialized, or someone that has ilm, that this person is going to look into your dispute. This qadi is going to look into the dispute and rule on the dispute, whether to end the marriage, to continue the marriage, that he has to pay a compensation, whatever it is. Then in that situation, what the qadi is going to rule is going to be mulzim. What does it mean that it's mulzim? That it is going to be exactly like you are putting right there a religious order. Mulzim. It's going to be like a religious order. You agreed to go to this qadi. What this qadi says is mulzim. But I know, let me give an example. Let's just say I took Ayan's laptop. I broke the laptop. And Ayan, notice that I broke the laptop not by accident, but on purpose. So we basically know Sheikh Zamzam, and we go to Sheikh Zamzam. She's a scholar. She's got the ilm in fiqh. She knows how to look into the details. She's got the experience. So she looked into the situation and said, I'm sure Aysha would not do it on purpose. So I'm going to tell you, sorry, Ayan, I'm not going to compensate. I'm not going to ask Aysha was to compensate you for your laptop. So Ayan says, Bas wallahi, she did it on purpose. She didn't care. But she says, you have any evidence? She says, well, I was the only one there. It was just me and her. But I know very well, were there cameras? There weren't any cameras. But I know very well, at least Ayan knows very well, that I did it on purpose. I literally took the laptop and smashed it. There's no way that that can be confused as to that was in any way by mistake. But what Zamzam ruled was based on the evidence. She said, sorry, you don't have any evidence. Here's one thing. The words that she laid out is mulzim. Ayan cannot say, but I know that she did it on purpose. I'm going to go smash her car. Khalas. She laid out the rule. She laid out the hukum, the judgment. That's it. I saw her smash my laptop. So here's the other part, the deen part. Religiously speaking, I'll be held accountable in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on Judgment Day. But you cannot retaliate and come after me because you accepted that Shaykh Zamzam would rule in this situation. Now, the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned that even if he were to rule based on what he had heard,
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
remind me to continue this point. This point is extremely
It's
important.
very important.
Yes.
So the screen is not working?
The screen. Oh,
Allah
so strange.
Akbar. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. سل بني إسرائيل كم آتيناهم من آية بينة ومن يبدل نعمة الله من بعد ما جاءته فإن الله شديد العقاب. زين للذين كفروا الحياة الدنيا ويسخرون من الذين آمنوا والذين اتقوا فوقهم يوم القيامة والله يرزق من يشاء بغير حساب. كان الناس أمة واحدة فبعث الله النبيين مبشرين ومنذرين وأنزل معهم الكتاب بالحق ليحكم بين الناس فيما اختلفوا فيه وما اختلف فيه إلا من بعد ما جاءتهم البينات بغيا بينهم فهدى الله الذين آمنوا لما اختلفوا فيه من الحق بإذنه والله يهدي من يشاء إلى صراط مستقيم. الله أكبر. يا الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. آمين. أم حسبتم أن تدخلوا الجنة ولما يأتكم مثل الذين خلوا من قبلكم مستهم البأساء والضراء وزلزلوا حتى يقول الرسول والذين آمنوا معه متى نصر الله ألا إن نصر الله قريب. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
All right, should we continue this piece of it? So like we said, so when you had judged, you basically judged based on the evidence. The evidence is البينة على المدعي واليمين على من أنكر. البينة, so everybody is innocent until proven guilty. So the way that she would have to rule is by the evidence. Based on the evidence, Ayan wasn't capable of bringing not a witness and not any evidence. So in that situation, she would basically rule that there's no evidence to prove me guilty. But the only two that would know that I am guilty, Ayan, myself, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But at the end of the day, Ayan cannot come up and say, well, even if Sheikha Zamzam ruled that she doesn't compensate me, that is Aysha Wazwaz does not owe me a compensation, I know that I'm right. I'm going to go smash her core, or I'm going to take the equivalent money to compensate me for the damaged laptop. Now, two things. Number one is that the qada in this situation is mulzim. What does that mean? That the rule, since we both agreed that we're going to go to Zamzam and she used the resources to rule in that situation, then Ayan and myself, we would have to accept her final judgment. Now, does that mean I'm not held accountable diniyan, religiously? No, I am held accountable religiously. The Prophet ﷺ himself actually said, I am a human being and I will rule based on what I hear. So if I had ruled in your favor, something that does not belong to you, then give it back to your Muslim brother, because at the end of the day, you will carry it as, in other words, being held accountable for it. Now, that's the part about al-hukm al-dini. And when we're talking about the qada'i part, the part that relates to giving a ruling or a judgment or a trial in this dunya.
It's called hukum?
Hukm qada'i and hukm dini. Now, here's one thing. So, yes, I will be held accountable religiously. That doesn't mean that if she ruled it, that's the end of it. Now, that's a very common thing that happens, and where husband and wife, they would come to probably somebody that is doing, let's say, a trial between both of them. The woman might get angry, yeah, well, he's a misogynist, etc., and basically reject the whole rule, probably claiming that he was a misogynist, that she didn't like what he said, he didn't give her the time to say what she has to say, etc., all of that. You agreed to go. At the end of the day, the final judgment was given. You have to accept it, whether you like it or you don't. Unless you would like to appeal, you would like to appeal, but then the final appeal, khalas. That's it. And by the way, even here in the US, if you were to actually appeal a certain rule, only a very small percentage of those cases get to be appealed or proven to an appeal, not all. And of course, the higher the type of court and the type of indictment, the less likely your request for an appeal is going to get approved. So in other words, not because you had requested an appeal, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to get an approval for the appeal. And many times what happens, and just what is making the different marriage problems even more confusing, or let me say more complex, is really because both the husband and the wife, they would go to the sheikh, and then if whether the husband or the wife, they did not get the rule that was in their favor, they would basically reject the whole thing, and it becomes an issue always unsolvable because she wants to claim one thing, he wants to claim one thing, and both don't recognize that hukm al-qadi is mulzim, that the rule that he gave at the end is actually to be applied on both of you. But unfortunately, because the Muslimin, they lack ilm in their deen, this is why we're getting our situations even more complex, because they don't recognize that. They would basically say, went to sheikh and he didn't do anything. What did you expect the sheikh to do? The sheikh was going to tell you what the rule is based on his judgment. What did you expect him to do? He doesn't have any authority to enforce the law. At the end of the day, basically gave the judgment. But then you'll find many, no, he either rules based on what I think is fair, or I'm going to reject it entirely. Now, the part about the surah right there, then we go into, of course, after speaking about a sufaha and dealing with money, then it went into talking about, well, what is the limit? What is the limit for the orphanage age? How old is a person supposed to be an orphan, or at least when does that age of orphanage actually end? In other words, the age of maturity, the age where they're actually responsible for their own money. They're given the authority over their own money, given the authority to make their own decisions, and so forth. Now, then it goes into speaking about money, then it goes into speaking about inheritance. Why? Because you could see that the emphasis in inheritance was, since we're talking about money, well, the most important type of money that basically gets into that dispute is really inheritance, will, and debt. Inheritance, will, and debt, because usually the person to leave behind an inheritance, those that are considered as in authority or the men, they are the ones that end up having their power make the final judgment. So that's why in these ayat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala definitely wanted the Muslims to abandon a previous culture in where women are totally neglected in inheritance. So the ayah, speaking about that, now you can see the coherence. Now we're going into this piece of it, and where the coherence and where how we deal with inheritance and how we deal with the other type of vulnerable ones, which basically is in a situation of wasiyah. Il-wasiyah, for those that are usually given the wasiyah / the will, are basically the vulnerable, the ones to usually need wasiyah, need will. Needy, those that are poor, etc. How do we relate to their rights in terms of will? And then the second part, which basically is, which basically is a dain. A dain is usually taken from debt, that is. So how do we deal with those that are in debt? So then, of course, it continues then, right there, speaking about, again, when we're speaking about those two pages, we're still giving the distribution and how to give the distribution, whether to parents, to brothers and sisters, siblings, or whether the children, the girls, the boys, the sons, the daughters, and then it continues there. Now,
Will cannot be more than a third, right?
Will, two things about will. Number one is that it cannot be more than a third of the inheritance. Meaning, whether we're talking about the inheritance to mean cash or whether we're speaking about property. Number two, those that are to be included in the will cannot be one of the inheritors. That the inheritors cannot be included in the will. There, we also talked about what is called al-wasiyya al-wajiba, in where if one of the inheritors normally, and what I mean by normally, in other words, the default rule is that that person inherits, but then this person had died before the inheritor.
Yes.
In that situation, well, not they, but their children, their children, that the person, and we talked about that person's children would get a wasiyya wajiba. And of course, there's actually a debate about that, but just wanted to mention it since we're talking about inheritance. Now, the other part is, of course, when we're talking about mahar, remember earlier in the beginning of the surah was talking about mahar. Well, then it wanted, since we talked about mahar, it basically took us into something a little related to it. Of course, many times, and this is often the case, to be honest, many women don't recognize their own value. They don't. I'll get it. Hold on. So many times women may not recognize their value, and they may give themselves access to other men or to men without even seeking, at least what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded, not necessarily the value, but what had regarded as a way of appreciation. Of course, in marriage, if she's going to be married to you, you have to give her the mahar. But other women may give other men access to them without even requiring them in a marriage bond. So that's why this ayah was taking us into that direction with the women that don't recognize their value, that don't recognize how to put a boundary for other men, and may, whether through consent or whether probably by being available, by being available publicly, that actually makes them exposed and certainly susceptible for other men to abuse them. So that's why this ayah right there is emphasizing the women that by consent actually engage in some form of engaging in al-fahisha. And one thing to say that in Lugha Arabiya, the word al-fahisha, although the word fahasha, which basically is the root, the conjugation from it, from the word fahisha, the root is fahasha. Now, one thing is that the word fahasha does not whatsoever mean in any, let me call it a very clear word. It doesn't mean penetration or any form of sexual relations, but the word fahisha in Lugha Arabiya actually means the extreme or the absolute illicit behavior. In other words, it was not giving me a word that was straightforward, because the Quran usually refers to such a behavior in a way that gives it an indication and not necessarily to be explicit in using the words and terminologies. So even when we're speaking about nikah, the word nikah does not mean whatsoever penetration. And the word nikah is actually in fact, in almost all the times, except once in the Quran, it was really referring to the marriage contract and not the actual intimacy or sexual relation. Now, the word fahisha, on the other hand, yes, it means zina, or at least it's referring to zina. It doesn't mean zina, it refers to zina. Why am I putting all this prelude right here? In order to explain how important it is to adopt the Quran's akhlaq, in where we don't use words that contain any type of explicit description. And the Quran does not use explicit description, even when it referred to speaking about men and in other words, husband and wife relations. It used the word lamasa as a severe touch, really, to refer to intimacy. Same third, it used the word fahisha to actually refer to zina, when all that word really means is an illicit behavior. This is what the word literally means, but the Quran was referring to definitely nothing but zina, nothing but zina. Now, as for the word zina, it does not explicitly mean penetration, and that's why the Prophet ﷺ explained what it really is, explained it in other hadith, and where he said it is exactly to see as if you are to see il-mil fil mikhala, as if you were to see il-mil fil mikhala. What is il-mil fil mikhala? To mean exactly like you were to have the eyeliner, you know, when you, the eyeliner, the kuhul, and it would have its own container. And in order to get the actual ink, you would have to insert it inside. So this is al-mil fil makhala. So the Prophet ﷺ did not go in detail in words, but he was giving them as a simile what he's actually talking about and what refers to zina. So let's continue with this ayah. So وَاللَّاتِي يَأْتِينَ الْفَاحِشَةَ مِن نِسَائِكُمْ.
What does zina mean then?
Zina?
Yeah.
So zina would mean any relationship outside of marriage. Any sexual relationship outside of marriage, without giving a descriptive explanation, of course. So that's basically to explain it. The Quran was always adopting the akhlaq and the adab, even when it spoke about these things. All right, that's why even in Surah al-An'am or al-Ma'idah, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talked about making wudu, all right, and he says, أو جاء أحدكم أو جاء أحد من الغائط. What is the ayah? I lost it. Totally lost it. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا قمتم إلى الصلاة فاغسلوا وجوهكم وأيديكم إلى المرافق وامسحوا برؤوسكم وأرجلكم إلى الكعبين. I went to a different area. All right. أو لامستم النساء. All right. So then we actually talked about the place. So al-gha'it does not mean feces. Al-gha'it means the area that was a low place in, of course, in the suburb or usually away from the main city where everyone's dwelling. And that was considered their place of public restroom. That was al-gha'it. Al-gha'it does not mean feces, does not mean any of that. So
you also zina is a type of fahisha, because one time also
zina
is
exactly.
Is showing what's private.
So isu wal fahsha is one straightforward to actually mean zina, but al fahisha can mean zina and can mean any type of a transgression against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the context can give me more details to see whether it is exclusively talking about zina or whether this is more inclusive to mean other types of illicit behavior. So here, وَاللَّاتِي يَأْتِينَ الْفَاحِشَةَ مِن نِسَائِكُمْ, and those women that practice al-fahisha. Fahisha, we just talked about it, the illicit behavior from your women. In other words, this is talking about the Muslim women. If non-Muslim women are engaging in that, we don't apply the rules of Islam on them. فَاسْتَشْهِدُوا عَلَيْهِنَّ أَرْبَعَةً مِّنْكُمْ. Then the word فَاسْتَشْهِدُوا, the alif, sin, ta in lugha Arabiya means to seek. So istat'ama means to seek and ask you for food. Istashhada, to seek witnesses. All right. So the alif sin ta right here, one of the meanings, not all the meanings, the alif sin ta istashhada means to seek the different witnesses. So this is not istashhada to mean a martyr. This is istashhidu, to seek witnesses. On who? Well, on the women. So alayhinna in lugha Arabiya, we would say on them, alayhinna. But in English, we don't say we'll seek for witnesses on them, but we would say to seek the witnesses that witnessed such a thing happening. So what is the witness supposed to be? Any type of a witness? We need 4 witnesses that had, 1, seen the event, seen what? Seen the actual penetration. Number 3, it's not enough to say and witness the situation, but we need to make sure that these 4 witnesses are actually in a state of adala. What is al-adala? Al-adala is not justice, but al-adala basically means that they are good in their deen, that they are honest, that they are people that will not accept any type of a bribe or anything like that. In other words, they're going to be religiously sound, mentally sound, and actually describe the situation and describe the details like the others. If one of them describes something else, or one of them is not, let's say, qualified to give such a witness, then the rest of the 3 would actually be held accountable for the transgression of qadf. Oh, the transgression of qadf. So in that situation, we would basically get each and every single one of the rest of the 3 the punishment of 80 lashes.
If they say something wrong.
Well, it's not if they say something wrong, but if one of them said, well, I didn't see that, or one of them said, no, actually, they had the door open, but I didn't see anything. They were just there, etc. Such a description, okay? So in that situation, we're going to say that the witness does not stand to be a qualified witness and a qualified evidence to make the punishment applicable on these two. Now, one thing, why 4 witnesses? Yet in the case of other transgressions, whether other crimes, violations, whether we're talking about killing or whether we're talking about stealing, and so many different types of violations in Islam, they don't take 4 witnesses. The only time that it takes 4 witnesses is basically in the situation of zina. Why? Because when we say 4 had witnessed a situation in Islam, the general rule, now keep this one in mind, in Islam, the general rule is that we're supposed to be covering is satr for whomever had done the violation. That's the general rule, is that you're supposed to be hiding it for them. You're supposed to be basically just keeping it secret. Definitely give them the maw'idha, definitely give them a good reminder, definitely find different means to probably bring an end to this. But if we're talking about a situation that you know can actually take them or take her into a slippery slope, then that's part of Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar. That's different than applying al-had min al-hudud. That's different than applying the capital punishment or the crime, the punishment for that particular crime. So what does that mean? When we're seeking to help somebody that's probably doing the wrong thing, maybe a classmate, she's hanging out with the wrong girls. These girls, we know that they are engaged in some type of a trafficking. Should I tell that girl's mom? Yes, tell that girl's mom. Because if you were to stay silent about it, then she's probably going to get involved in all of this. Then that's one way of giving Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar. Oh, that's a different story. But if this is involving where we actually have a rule, once it reaches the government, then it becomes a public issue. And once it reaches the government, then in that situation, you cannot say, well, I'm going to change the situation. Once it reaches the government, then it becomes a government here law, a violation that was committed in where the government cannot then say, well, we're not going to apply the law. Once it reaches the government, and what I mean by the government, I mean the Muslim government. Okay. So for example, let's just assume, I'm going to explain it. Let's just assume person A went into your house, stole $50,000. I don't know what $50,000 would do in your home, but whatever. All right, stole $50,000. You saw them. You looked at the camera. The cameras got a great photo shoot of that person. Now, do I have to go and tell the government that this person stole $50,000? No, I don't have to. If you want to, if that person gave you the money, it's a different story. All right. But let's say you later decided that you wanted to forgive the person. You can do that. But once you report that to the government, and once the government gets a hold of that person, you can't say, well, I forgive them. Too late.
Oh, yeah.
That's it. Now this is a government issue, not your issue anymore. Once it reaches the government, khalas. Same thing. Even during the time of the Prophet told him, now that it reached me that you want to come to me, we can't. Once it reaches the government, then it becomes a government report, a government policy, because there are certain laws and rules that must be applied. Got it?
Yes.
Now, Same thing when we're looking here. If this was in a case was not reported, all right, we don't have to report. We don't have to report. But once it gets reported to the government, then the government does the investigation. If the evidence, 4 witnesses were there to report the situation, the 4 witnesses, why 4 witnesses? Because then it has gone to public.
Yes.
Once it became public, well, how else were you actually doing such an act in the witness and in the presence of 4 witnesses? Then this wasn't something that was private. Then that was something that was done publicly. Now, here's one thing. It's absolutely haram to somehow try to spy on someone to see whether they're doing such a thing or not.
Even for husband who
Husband and wife, that's li'an. That's a different story, okay? That's a different story. All right? فاستشهد, that's a totally different story. That's in Surah An-Nur, we'll get to it. فَإِن شَهِدُوا فَأَمْسِكُوهُنَّ فِي الْبُيُوتِ. Now, it's very important to mention, why does Islam regard this as severe? And why can't we say that, hey, they gave consent, and let's consider that if she's giving consent, that we should somehow give sanctity to a person's consent. Now, number 1 is that in Islam, the hierarchy, or let's call it the authority and the superiority, is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's principles. All this is important to keep in mind. And in Islam, when you look at the laws, the criminal laws, or let's talk about this segment right here. In Islam, the highest crime that somebody could do is basically leave the deen. Irridda. That's number 1. Number 2 is killing somebody. Oh, killing somebody. Number 3 is zina. Number 4 is drinking or drugs. Number 5 is a violation against wealth, property, or wealth, whether it's destroying someone's property, stealing, gambling, all of that. Now, let's look at it this way. In Islam, when you look at the D-N-A-I-M, okay? Now, we did mention before that there's a dispute between scholars whether the A comes first or the I comes first. Let me first explain that one for the new ones. D stands for deen, religion. N stands for nafs, to mean life. A stands for aql, to mean mind and mental health. I stands for ird, to mean chastity. And M stands for mal, which means property. Now, scholars had differences of opinions on whether the A is preceding the ird or not, meaning is mental health preceding sexual / family / chastity health or not, or let's call it not necessarily health only, but let's call it an area of sanctity. So in Islam, this is basically regarding that the sanctity to the deen takes precedent over the sanctity to human life. Human life takes the sanctity and a higher precedence over ird and chastity. The ird takes the higher end of precedence over mental health. So therefore, the higher up you go, the severer the punishment, because Islam regards it as a more dangerous violation within the society. The severer the violation, the severer the punishment. All right? Simple. And of course, the down more you go, the less severe, of course, the punishment will be. So for example, the violation against wealth, for example, is basically amputating the hand, all right, amputating the hand. Well, that's not equivalent at all as to a violation against the deen, because that actually means capital punishment.
with apostate.
Well, apostasy is not actually equivalent to ridda. Apostasy is not equivalent to ridda because apostasy has its own definition in, let me say, the Christian world, and it has its own roots, it has its own history. It's totally different than ridda. I know that the Western media likes to talk about ridda as if it's apostasy and equivalent to it. Islam has its own rules in regards to what defines a violation and what defines levels of justice and what defines or what qualifies as an evidence to prove different things. It has its own rules. And a lot of times the translations for certain violations in Islam or words, they basically are totally different. They like to use these kind of words in order to make it applying a certain traditional action that they had in the West, but it's a totally different thing. Ridda has its own conditions. In fact, ridda in Islam, not because somebody turned away from the religion, we have to do what is called al-istitaba. What is al-istitaba? Al-istitaba actually means that we would have the person sit with scholars and explain where their confusion is and all of these different things. That's when we would give them time. We would give them time, and scholars had differences of opinions on whether it's 3 days or more or 3 months, or whether they have to be proselytizing their thought, or whether it's something that is something that they're making it confidential for themselves. So we won't go running after people to see whether they really had left Islam or not. Now, one thing is that there are also differences of opinions between scholars if a woman were to commit ridda, on whether we do apply the ridda had on her or not. It's a different story. Now, the other part, which is the sanctity of human life. So al-qatil yuqtal, and then we would have al-qisas, of course, and then do we do diya, and then we would say whether this crime against the sanctity of human life, whether it was amd or shibh amd, whether it was on purpose, or whether the person was not meaning to do such a thing, and so forth. Then, of course, we go for the ird right there. So there's a difference between zina that was committed by somebody that had no marriage experience, or whether somebody had a marriage experience before. And that is when we would say thayyib, or when we're talking about al-bikr. What was that?
100 lashes or stoning.
So the stoning would be for somebody that had a marriage experience before, whether they are divorced or not. They had a marriage experience before, okay? And the 100 lashes would be for somebody that had never had a marriage experience before.
Even if they're prostitute.
So yes, but in the end, if we're going to get to that part, because there are certain things where if a person engages in such a type of a behavior in where even the 100 lashes is not stopping them from that behavior, then we can go to another type of ta'zir. So the different types of criminal law punishments in Islam, there are al-hudud, and al-hudud would basically be their fixed numbers. They're fixed, and you can't go beyond that. It's a fixed way, it's a fixed manner. You can't invent your own way. But then there's a ta'zir. التعزير, differences of opinions between scholars on how and what are the different methods of ta'zir. What is ta'zir? So ta'zir is really left for the government to assign the different types of punishments for different types of violations. So whether that's imprisonment, community service, or probably a fine to pay, or perhaps even flogging. Okay, so that's left for the qadi, or the government to assign. And then scholars had differences of opinions. They're almost into 14 different types. I'm just making it short. 14 different types. And then they had differences of opinions on whether it can be up to the limit of certain hudud. So the word had actually means a limit. Okay, it actually means a limit. Now, certain hudud, in where can we go up to 100 lashes? Can we go up to 20 flogs, for example? All right. And or is that, no, that you had then went into a totally different category. Okay. Now, one thing to say is that when we're speaking about corporal punishment in Islam, corporal punishment in Islam is only to be for these violations when it's against what Islam considers as sanctuary. So the sanctity of deen, since the government itself is founded on the deen, it's exactly like, for example, here in America, you actually go against the system. It's considered a form of what? They'll consider it as a form of going against the foundations of government, and then you'll probably be classified, maybe committing some form of spying, or some form of going against the government, or you might be called different names or classified different things, and where you could actually lose your right of citizenship, or hey, you're talking about different people as well, even when they went against certain figures, and they just like who was that guy's name?
Snowden.
Exactly, like Snowden and all of those, and in the end is where they were accused of what? Espionage?
Yeah.
Exactly, or treason, committing treason, and so forth. So in Islam, the government is founded on Tawheed. The government is founded on Tawheed. That's the center. So Islam would consider that since the government is founded on Tawheed, that's going against, and especially if the person is proselytizing the ideas that are contradictory to what the government is founded on. Proselytizing, not believing, but proselytizing. That's that fine line. If that person is proselytizing such ideologies that are contradictory to Tawheed, that not Christianity or Judaism, because that Islam considers, well, that's their faith. They can not proselytize it amongst Muslims, but they can preach it around themselves. Okay? That won't be considered as a form of treason in Islam. They have that right. Okay? But when it's a Muslim, and they had then proselytized, they had abandoned Islam, and they started preaching different or proselytizing ideas that are contradictory to what the country stands on, which is Tawheed, then in that situation, the government is going to consider it as a form of treason, and that is threatening the foundation of the government. So in that situation, that's when it would be considered as ridda. Okay? That's when it would be considered as ridda. Number two is basically the violation against human life. Violation against human life, it's basically capital punishment unless it was done by mistake or unless the family forgives that person. Unless they would forgive that person and probably asked a compensation for the blood money, etc., which is almost maybe $200,000 or maybe a little more. Okay. Number three, so basically aql. Okay, so al-aql, the chastity and the sanctity of human mind is, and also the community's human mind is very sanctuary in Islam. So using alcohol or distributing, selling drugs or buying drugs or distributing drugs or maybe marketing drugs is considered a violation against human mind, and therefore Islam regards it as a violation, in that situation, a crime. Number four.
My problem is you taught us these things the right way. And then
What was that?
My problem is you taught us these things the right way and then you're passing through it. So I just have a question on the one that you're killing. So when you taught us, you mentioned first class degree murder, second, and then manslaughter. And for the first one, you said the 250, the person who killed.
So no. The first degree murder in Islam, it's not first degree murder, second degree murder.
Okay.
It's either that you had committed a murder or whether you had not committed a murder. In other words, it's a pseudo murder in. Okay, let me clarify that one because even that translation is not accurate.
Okay.
Let me clarify it. So if a person committed a murder,
Okay.
in other words, they planned for it, they ended up killing the person. Okay,
Yes.
this is amd. You
Yes.
did it, you planned it, and that's basically a murder right there. Okay, now this one is pretty straightforward.
You pay the blood money, not your family.
You pay the blood money, not your money, not your family. Okay, or they also have the right to say, well, he slaughtered our son, he killed our son, whatever it is. We would like the government to actually execute this person.
Yes.
Okay, straightforward. Now, capital punishment. The second type would be shibh al-amd. All right. Shibh al-amd, it's near, it is almost, let's say on purpose, but it's not fully on purpose. So let's say, for example, we got in a fight. All right. I basically slapped you, and then with the slap, we were standing on the bridge. I just wanted to slap you. But instead, you got slapped and you lost balance. Boom, you fell into basically on the other side. Your head bangs against a rock, smashes, and dies. I just slapped. I didn't mean to make you fall off the bridge. It was just a slap. I absolutely didn't mean it.
You did not.
Sorry, guys. I wouldn't do such a thing, but I'm just.
So you did not.
So this is shibh amd. Well, the person did not intend an actual killing. It basically happened, and all the different circumstance that was around the situation do not show that the person intended an actual death crime. Got it? It's a different story. All right. Person just slapped a person. It was just a heated debate and heated argument, and just meant to just slap the person. The person just lost balance and went the other way.
So you pay blood money, you can forgive or execute too for this one?
The second one, which is by mistake.
Yes.
So by mistake, no, you don't execute the person because
Okay.
they did intend to kill. They don't get an execution. They would pay blood money, and the blood money is ala al-aqila, on the family.
On the family, okay.
On the family. All right. But then, of course, we would have to have the investigators actually see what happened in the situation and so forth. Now, finally, the part about alcohol or drugs, then let's put the drugs on a side a little bit, because with alcohol, it's actually clear that in the hadith that the Prophet ﷺ had actually mentioned that there's flogging. It's not capital punishment. It's, whether the person has a liquor store, etc. At the end of the day, is that it's basically flogging. But then they had differences of opinions on whether it's 40 flogs or whether it was 80 flogs.
What is flogs?
lashes. Okay. Now, one thing to mention is that the flogging has a number of different things. So it's not that, you know, some guy with that is muscular and he's got these whipping things and starts to write. No, the flogging has a number of different conditions. Number one is that the tool is basically not to have any nails in it, any sharp ends, etc. No, it's supposed to be a way of discipline and not a way of killing. Number two is that the person that is doing it is not raising their hands. In other words, they're not showing their armpits. You're not trying to harm the body. The person is literally, it's like a pencil and a little thicker, okay? And the person is, that's basically it. You can't raise your hands. You can't use material that is probably going to break the person. No, it's a more of something that is elastic and not something that will break the person. So you can't use items like steel or items like sticks, etc. It is to discipline and not to break the person. In terms of men, of course, oh, sorry about the drugs part. The drugs part. So the qadi in Islam, there weren't any drugs, okay? They did have different items that, especially during the time of al-Hashashin, they used that ironically as a way of spiritual. It's really strange, you believe it or not, but we had a time in history where there was a cult that actually used different types of drugs and said that it was getting them high spiritually. I know, it's like, what? High spiritually. Yeah, exactly. See, and they were a cult. They were a cult, and it was actually engaging in a lot of deviances. Anyhow.
So accident is a bad one.
No, I'm going to get to the aql right now. So in terms of drugs, the drugs, the scholars did definitely do al-qiyas that drugs are similar to alcohol, but then, of course, when we're speaking about drugs, we know that they're a lot more addicting, that in fact, that drugs, you know, depends on the type of street drugs, that they can actually be a lot more dangerous. You see the people that use meth, ya Allah, that is extremely sad to be honest. In where I think it's called Flanatel or something like that. I forgot what the name was. What was it? Fentanyl, I believe that's what it's called. But anyhow, and then I actually do a lot of, most of those that I do chaplaincy for in prison that are not Muslim, I'm talking about the non-Muslims, are actually involved in selling this product and meth. It's extremely addicting, and it can actually cause a lot of harm. So it's more than any other plant, because this is actually something that is cooked at home, and they would basically get some cold medications and different things. So it's a chemical that most of the times is actually imported from India. It's a chemical imported from India, and in a lot of the cough medications, they would get a lot of the cold and cough medications, and actually some other items that they would get from basically different chemicals, and then they would cook it at home, and it becomes, it becomes extremely addicting. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect our sons and daughters from it, ya Allah, and protect us from it. It's extremely addicting. It makes the person start, losing their mind and acting in a very insane way. It changes all their appearance. This is actually the number one thing in California, the number one thing in different parts of America right now. It's really that meth part. Anyhow, so in that situation, the qadi or the government can actually assign with ta'zir a higher, let's say, violation in basically in order to protect the masses from the different implications of such violations and depending on the harm. Now, the final part, which is mal, property, the preservation of property. So whether we're talking about stealing and that situation, because property is sanctuary and because people's financial rights are sanctuary. That's why in Islam, there is a difference between somebody doing something covertly and between doing something that involves terror. So what does that mean? If we're talking about somebody that is like a nashal, a person, maybe you're walking down the street and secretly they take your wallet out, it's out of your purse, okay? That's totally different than a person that goes into, for example, a store and uses a gun and tells you, give me your money with their gun right at your head, and you're right there opening the cash register and getting them the money, but then the gun is at your head in that situation. So then in that situation, this is called the haraba, or haraba is a different type and a different level, in where it actually involves amputating one arm and one leg, one from the right and one. So definitely, somebody might say, isn't that brutal? So in Islam, in order, first of all, in order to define something as brutal, you have to first define your resource for what defines what is humane. Okay, before you even go, what is the resource that defines what is humane? All right, so in Islam, it tells you, well, it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is the resource to define what is humane. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the resource to define justice. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the resource to define what is human rights. In Islam, defined that human rights is the preservation of people's deen, nafs, aql, ird, mal, basically these items. All right, that's the first part, in where Islam regards that it's the definition, and therefore humans to define themselves, that is not necessarily not containing certain biases. So they would want to say that it's completely subjective, but at the end of the day, is that you can't be completely subjective, because you as a human being, you're basically having a lot of different influences, whether it's your money, whether it's your history, or probably your own benefit of how you want to define certain things. So Islam regards that, no, yes, because human life and because humans are, and their rights are sanctuary, that's why Islam regards that, well, because human life and because human rights, whether we see that in nature, well, that's what basically John Locke wanted to say, and where he considered that, well, whether we're talking about liberty or whether we're talking about human life, there's certain things that he or other philosophers regarded as, well, we need to consider those as those areas, and where they had their own definition of what makes the definition of the philosophy of justice. So Islam regards that, no, what makes the philosophy of justice is really Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It starts with regarding these points as the areas of sanctity, and therefore Islam regards as the second thing, which is that a human life is actually the second priority in maintaining. So Islam is not saying that human life is cheap, but is actually considering it as in high level of sanctity, and it's so sanctuary that it regarded that the only time that we would regard human life as basically a place of not having the right of sanctity when it attacks another human life. Oh, number two, when we want to look at the irb. Now, the West, of course, gave higher level to human consent because the Western philosophy had regarded that the center in regarding one truth is human mind. So that's why it's all about consent. As long as the person gives consent, whether the person gave consent for sexual relations or different behaviors, that's basically considered as the highest level of sanctity. In Islam, consent is not necessarily the place of sanctity. That does not mean that Islam does not regard consent to having extreme importance. No, Islam does regard that consent is to be respected on a condition that it does not go against the standards of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the highest place of sanctity is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not human consent. The human can consent, and it would be considered as holding a level of sanctity or a level of respect once that person is not violating the main standards of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we might agree to sell a home. Islam regarded your consent must be respected, and you must respect the consent that you had given. I said I was going to sell my home. We were together, and you said, I agree. Sale is done. All we need to do, sign the papers, but sale is done. You have to respect the consent that you had given. And therefore, you can't go back on it. Sale is done. Islam gives extreme importance to consent, but considers that such consent cannot go against Allah.
Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
So there are certain things when it comes to consent. So in Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was very clear about it, that there's no consent if it violates the main principle and the main standards that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had set. So the human consent does not void Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives you the right and at least gives you the permission to consent, then in that situation, you have to take that consent and the word that you had given seriously, and you will be held accountable for the consent that you had given in the areas that you were given the right to consent or not consent to, such as marriage. You have the right to say, well, I don't want to be in this marriage. The marriage basically becomes invalid. Got it? Now, in the West, when it comes to human consent and how much of weight does it carry, that's where, of course, there were all these different debates in where, for example, can you consent to ending your own life or euthanasia? Can you consent to selling drugs, taking drugs? Can you consent to sexual relations? Can you consent to prostitution? Can you consent to certain things about money, interest, etc.? So in Islam, there are certain things where it did regard, like I said, that consent to being sanctuary. But in certain areas, it tells you your consent does not change the fact that you're giving consent to the wrong thing. Got it? So things, can somebody consent to actually have their life taken away?
No.
No, in Islam, no. In certain Western countries, they're still debating about it. In certain Western countries, you can consent to actually give your life away. Can consent. There was a debate. What if I consented that I would like to have my sight taken away? And the list goes on and on. Can I consent to probably get transformed and certain body parts be amputated because I feel like a different gender or whatever? This is completely, here right now in the US, this is considered a form of consent, and you would have to respect it. Right now in America, aren't they amputating the children's genitalia and amputating the children's bodies? Really, that's exactly what it is. That's why in Islam, it's considered, even if they had given consent, it's actually considered a crime against humanity. In Islam, it's a crime against humanity. It's a crime against humanity, even if they consented to it.
Canada.
Oh, we can go on and on. Sweden, Switzerland, we can go on and on. Let's continue. When we're speaking about chastity, I think the West was very contradictory about the chastity part, because then you'll have different areas on, is prostitution supposed to be legal, illegal, and how they look into it and so forth, especially in Holland. Guess it's a different area. All right. Yep, a totally different area. So then is it, or even Italy, that it's, hey, I'm consenting to it and so forth. Now, this is extremely important. That's why in Islam, it tells you that there are certain things, even if you consent to it, just the human consent does not necessarily mean hold the sanctity just because you gave the consent. No, there are certain things, they are wrong whether you accept it or not. Whether you accept it or not. Why? Because you may not recognize not only the implication it has on your life, but the implication it has on the society as well. Got it? So that's why it's important to actually study, and I think I mentioned before, philosophy of justice, and we mentioned before Michael Sandel and his 19 lectures, and really interesting to watch those, the debate that he, well, okay, let me correct that. It wasn't a debate. was a lecture in Harvard on philosophy of ethics and all of that, and how the students were responding to that. And of course, he was challenging them with a lot of questions. But philosophy of ethics, I think, is extremely important to study, because you cannot understand your Islam unless you know how the modern and contemporary philosophy of ethics is, I would say, set about. And that many times we would say people, and especially Muslims, losing lack of confidence in regards to speaking about Sharia, because they would have in their mind that there is that area, that as if it is the West that had given the final definition of what is human life, what is sanctuary, what makes the philosophy of justice, what makes justice, what defines justice, etc. And they don't recognize that all of this is actually man-made. In fact, even in the philosophy of ethics, there are these debates on the resources that define ethics, or even on how to apply them.
قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله. So, Allahu Akbar. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين يا أيها المدثر قم فأنذر وربك فكبر وثيابك فطهر والرجز فاهجر ولا تمنن تستكثر ولربك فاصبر فإذا نقر في الناقور فذلك يومئذ يوم عسير على الكافرين غير يسير ذرني ومن خلقت وحيدا وجعلت له مالا ممدودا وبنين شهودا ومهدت له تمهيدا ثم يطمع أن أزيد كلا إنه كان لآياتنا عنيدا سأرهقه صعودا إنه فكر وقدر فقتل كيف قدر ثم قتل كيف قدر ثم نظر ثم عبس وبصر ثم أدبر واستكبر فقال إن هذا إلا سحر يؤثر إن هذا إلا قول البشر سأصليه سقر وما أدراك ما سقر لا تبقي ولا تذر لواحة للبشر عليها 19 الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. القارعة ما القارعة وما أدراك ما القارعة يوم يكون الناس كالفراش المبثوث وتكون الجبال كالعهن المنفوش فأما من ثقلت موازينه فهو في عيشة راضية وأما من خفت موازينه فأمه هاوية وما أدراك ما هي نار حامية ألهاكم التكاثر حتى زرتم المقابر كلا سوف تعلمون ثم كلا سوف تعلمون كلا لو تعلمون علم اليقين لترون الجحيم ثم لترونها عين اليقين ثم لتسألن يومئذ عن النعيم. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
Of what's happening.
Just for the sake of time, so if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them before we end the session.
I have a question.
Mhm.
What if the deaths, you didn't cover two deaths, accident or abortion? Accident
Accidents.
So like, I didn't plan to kill the person, but I was driving, I hit a person. That one, what do I do? Do I have to pay the blood money? Or
So
they can forgive me?
accident, so if we're talking about a,
drugs and not accidents.
right, so in terms of accidents, any type of killing, all right, whether that was using an arm or whether that was using a car, any means of killing a person. In other words, it involves that you had determined, 1, 2, that tool is, or it can be used as a way of committing a crime, then in that situation it would be a first degree murder. Okay,
The fourth one, accident. I didn't plan, I was just driving back home. I hit a person on the road.
right. So this is not even, this is shibh amd. So you didn't mean it.
What's the ruling on it?
You would pay the blood money. The family would help you pay the blood money. You didn't mean it. At the end of the day, the person is dead.
So you'd pay the blood money?
And you
or
would fast 2
forgiveness?
months in a row.
That's what I want.
Yeah, you would fast 2 months in a row. Now, the part about, forgot what I wanted to say. I forgot what I wanted to
So
say.
you'd pay blood money and also fast 2 months?
And also fast 2 months.
Okay, and then a person can forgive you for the blood money if they want.
The person can forgive you for the blood money if they want.
Okay, and the one for drugs, like you're using drugs and then you kill the person. It's just clothing on me,
So, okay, fair
a
enough.
person dies.
So if fair enough, this actually did happen often. If that type of drug that was given is known to causing death, then in that situation, the person is involved in the murder of somebody. But if that type of drug is only to cause death if the person himself made the choice to overdose, then the person is not held accountable for at least the death of that person. You understand what I'm saying?
You got it.
And that's the same thing when we're talking about magic. Certain magic, if that method was mentioned by certain specialists that made tawbah, that were magicians, and they said that that actually leads to death, then in that situation, the person is going to be held accountable for being involved in killing somebody. But if it doesn't, then we would hold that magician accountable for the violation that it leads to.
And if the magicians or the drug killed a person, does it become the shibli ham? The second one?
So here's one thing. Yes, it becomes shibh hamd, but we would actually need experts to be involved in investigating the case.
Okay.
All right. So we would definitely need experts to look at the consequence, or at least look at the circumstance. Look at the circumstance, look at and investigate, and definitely psychologists to sit with that person to investigate in all the different ends, and definitely autopsy to be done to make sure that event or whatever was involved, that it really led to this type of killing. Because autopsy is extremely important in such cases.
Last one, death by illegal abortion.
Illegal.
If I go kill illegal abortions.
Okay.
specifically.
So what do you mean by illegal abortion? I'm assuming haram
The person-
abortion?
Haram abortion.
Okay, fair enough.
Not halal abortion.
So haram abortion, if a woman were to do that haram abortion, she would have to pay the blood money for the husband. If the husband were to do the abortion, and then in that situation, he has to pay the blood money. Okay, and it's called ghurratul janeen, which is approximately give or take almost $7,000 to $8,000. All right, and of course, you might say, well, okay, well that's not a big deal. At least I protect myself from taking care of a baby or whatever, etc. And fasting 2 months. All right, but that is considered a crime in Islam. Unless the woman's life was in danger, then that is a different story. Okay.
What if both they agree?
If they both agreed, then they are both held accountable for the killing of a child.
Who do they pay then?
Who do they pay? So at the end, they both have to basically do that sadaqah and actually do that ghurra in where to donate it or even to get it to the rest of the family. At the end of the day, is that they are responsible. They are responsible. And then scholars would have differences of opinions on who is the one to actually get diyat al-jani in that situation, or is it not to go anywhere, or is there no diya, since both of them are actually considered the legal parents, but they are held accountable in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Differences of opinions, all right? But definitely it's haram. This is actually what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah al-Mumtahina, وَلَا يَقْتُلْنَ أَوْلَادَهُنْ. So that not to kill their own children was considered one of the main things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had taken upon women. Same thing definitely upon men as well. That's it. وَإِيَّكُمْ. Any other questions? Go ahead, my dear.
So you mentioned the qadi between someone's like going when someone goes to a qadi. Is that any person with a fiqh background? And is that the ma'azila? Is that for a specific question? Is that for like?
So al-qadi is different than a mufti.
Okay.
Okay. Al-mufti does not have to hear both sides. The qadi is supposed to be hearing both sides. And for a person to be a qadi, they also have to have experience in investigation. They might need to use other resources for investigation. So for example, we may need to get other things involved to make sure that we're actually getting the right information in place. So it can happen that many times the mufti or the qadi can lack ilm in certain cases, right? So for example, a qadi can say, well, the wife refused, for example, since we're speaking about women and wives and so forth, the wife is refusing her husband's bed, and therefore that's haram. May not have the ilm that for example, that may require an OB to say, well, Mr. Qadi, this woman is actually having an issue of pelvic issue, and if she were to actually be intimate with her husband, that's actually going to be extremely painful, and la darar wa la darar. So it's really important in certain cases that we do involve other experts to make a fair judgment. In where getting maybe OBs involved, maybe bankers involved, maybe experts in business involved, experts in money laundering involved, experts in probably drugs, whatever. So unfortunately, we don't really have these types of qadis that are trained in all of this. And certainly at many times we see, even in the books of fiqh, to be honest, even in the books of fiqh right now, I think in the books of fiqh, they laid out, I would say, the basis for trials. But I think it's fair to say that where and what the court system in the West has really developed, I think is something that right now Muslim jurists should also benefit from. And I got involved in different courts. I think it's really important. And hikmat dallatul mu'min. We definitely have to use these different methods to make sure that we're making a fair trial. And whether getting other experts involved, to mean psychologists, maybe to make sure that this person is mentally healthy, or getting OBs if it needs an OB, or even different specialists to make sure that we're actually looking and making a fair trial. I think a lot of times the qadis in the masajid, etc., they might not have the ilm and rule, I would say, on a primitive resource in the books of fiqh, and not recognize that there are tools and there are certain things that may actually be a factor, an important factor, before we make a judgment. And I come across this oftentimes where having knowledge in regards to probably mental health or probably different things in medicine are extremely important, and they could be the factors to a lot of marriages probably getting destroyed, or probably even disputes in business, or disputes in different things, and we don't recognize, even in family, when in reality it was really either a mental problem or probably misunderstanding somehow. So I think a lot of the qadis during our times, they're more focused on trying to bring about a reconciliation than actually figuring out what the root of the problem is. Because it's not enough to bring about some common ground of a communication and reconciliation. And a lot of times the qadis are really trying to, let's just get it over with. Let's make an understanding. Oh, come on, be patient, etc. And then we end up really just sweeping a lot of the problems under the rug. And when you're constantly sweeping the problems under the rug, at the end of the day, they're going to continue to accumulate. And then without you recognizing, you had not solved the problem, you had just made it even bigger. And soon it's going to start penetrating from the rug up onto the surface. So that's why it's really important to see other resources. I often direct people to going to marriage counselors, because there are certain studies, certain ways and certain methods, and I would respect. And I'm talking about a Muslim marriage counselor, for example, and where they can, in certain pathology, they can have the resources to help you solve a lot of the different problems, rather than using the primitive way and saying, oh, get it over with and just solve it, and it's your fault or his fault. Sometimes it's not an issue of whose fault is it. Sometimes it's knowing the science of how to get to the root cause and solve it, and not necessarily let it grow bigger. And this is extremely important. And within our community, I'm emphasizing on the part about marriage. I think within our community, a lot of the problems, let me call them the private problems, and you know what I mean, I think are not solved, and are not talked about, and are not traded. Simply because many times the woman, of course, is shy. Yarhamkumullah, a woman is shy to say the actual problem. And because it's usually a man that's going to be judging the case. And the man doesn't want to be open about his personal life, when in reality, the problem was actually there. I think OB problems are a major factor within our homes that are rarely talked about. Alhamdulillah, as a woman, I get to hear from women, and as a woman, I get to see and get involved in the problem within the women's area. And I really think we need more OBs teaching women about their bodies and what is out there. And it will solve a lot of marriages. a lot of marriages. I think these things actually get swept under the rugs, and that many times it leads to a lot of confusion. I know on the other side, whether we're talking about certain dysfunctions, in the men, etc., that does happen. There's no doubt about that. And yes, even men, they don't want to talk about these dysfunctions, just like women don't want to admit certain dysfunctions. So but women are more accepting to see a doctor than a woman, or than a man actually go to a doctor and admit that I have a problem. It is this type of dysfunction. So they would rather not talk about it because they would think that it basically attacks and somehow exactly his masculinity is harmed and etc. and all of that. But alhamdulillah, I think there's a level of respecting the confidentiality within at least the healthcare, the mental health, and alhamdulillah, we have a lot of Muslim doctors and Muslim specialists. We're not just talking about the doctors only, but we're also talking about specialists in mental health as well that can respect and even preserve the confidentiality. And I think it's important to use these resources, and rather than think, oh, I'm just going to go to a sheikh and the sheikh shall solve everything. I think sometimes we give too much credit and too much to how much a sheikh can solve. And I think it's fair to say that we need to learn how to use the other resources to help us solve our problems. We need to put these areas and these resources within our wagon to help us solve our problems. The sheikh is not specialized in OB, and he's not going to know whether you've got a pelvic issue or what that problem is, or whether you've got an estrogen issue or whatever it is. And the same thing, the sheikh is not going to know whether, hey, you've got your prostate needs to be checked or whatever it is, and definitely not. He's trained in one thing. So you would have to learn in the sheikh, and we definitely need our shuyukh, and those are that are acting as, and right now, I would say wearing the hat of marriage counselors to learn about those areas, because they can be dangerous factors. They need to learn about those areas, educate themselves about those areas, whether we're talking about mental health, whether we're talking about men's health, women's health, and a lot of different, or even financing and etc. We definitely need competent imams, competent scholars to learn about those areas in order to help those that come to their office find the right resources to help them, rather than just bet on the person's capacity of enduring the harm. Because if you want to bet on a person's capacity in enduring harm, then at the end of the day is that لا ضرر ولا ضرار. You are just putting a person under pressure when there are these resources that can help remove the pressure, and that way you'll have both parties happy. You see what I'm saying? So I really think that we need to ask, even if we're talking about board members in the masajid, to require the shuyukh and our scholars to attend classes on women's health, classes on men's health, classes on mental health, classes on even learning what happens in the court system, attending law, attending different classes. It's not enough to have Sharia classes, but you have to take these classes to make sure that you are competent to help those that are coming to your office find the resources that are necessary. If a doctor forced to perform the abortion for a pregnant woman, and the doctor knows that the woman doesn't have a health issue and she will be okay, that would actually be considered in getting involved in a crime, and it's haram. So do not do the job if it involves a crime. If it's a crime, it's a crime. All right.
One question. Last
Yep. Last one.
So I love how she explained erd, and she said the difference between Western staff.
philosophy and
I think
idea.
that's the best thing today. It's because they place the human mind
Yeah.
as the place of like knowledge and rulings. So in Islam, is it? I'm just trying to think out loud. Does that include that for chastity, which is family? I'm just talking about the family base, not the modesty part. For the family base as a Muslim, then the entire fiqh of marriage dictates my rules of family and how it's structured and what's needed into that, and not the Western one, which is based on consent and the human and what the person wants. Is that a correct definition?
So I agree with you in where the West regards pleasure generally, pleasure and the individual as the place of sanctity. In Islam, no, the family, the family holds a high level of sanctity in where the child, even before they are even created, even before they're even created, Islam considers that they have the right that they would have their father be aware to them, and the father holds certain responsibilities to ensure the child's rights are actually met. And it's not just the father, but it's also not the child only, but it's also the woman as well. So even if the person gave the consent to give up on their rights, there are certain rights that Islam regarded as sanctuary. You don't have the right to give up on them. So let's say a person consented on a contract that involves riba, but I consented, I'm okay, they can take my money. In Islam tells you, no, you can't do that. You cannot give up on something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded as sanctuary, which is your freedom. You cannot, this is not something to be sold. Your honor, your freedom is not something to be sold. Even if you consented to it, we're going to void such a contract from the start, because this contradicts the ABCs of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created in nature as a place and a center for justice. So in Islam, justice is extremely important. It is of high sanctity that no one can whatsoever give up, even what it involves in their own right. Justice in Islam is so sanctuary that even if you consented to give up on your justice, Islam tells you no, that you do not have the right to go against justice. Even if you consented to it, we're going to tell you, no, you should not. No, you should not, and we're not going to accept it. In fact, we're going to void the whole contract. We're going to void the whole system, because justice is what takes precedence over everything. Who defines justice? Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Definitely not John Locke, and definitely not David Hume, and certainly not Kant, and not Descartes, and none of those people. Allahu Akbar. That's it. All right. All right. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I know today was really buttery, right?